say anything tonight. From oblivion.
OK, would a Sunak premiership save the Tories from electoral oblivion? Now, Chris Chope, you have seen a lot of leaders of the Conservative Party come and go in your time. There's always a sort of king or queen over the water that would be better than the current leader. What's your answer to Anthony?
Well, I think the current leader is my 9th leader since I've been a Member of Parliament.
But you're not counting.
So my answer to him would be that the Conservative Party will face oblivion if we get rid of Liz Truss. So that's my first part. And the second thing is there's no way in which Rishi Sunak is going to become the leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister. There's too much of a coalition of opposition against him, including myself, within the Parliament.
But why? Because, I mean, it's interesting. You're the first Conservative MP that I've spoken to that has basically said, yep, Liz Truss is the way forward. Even a lot of people who voted for her have now become, shall we say, somewhat sceptical. He said, understating it. Why do you think that the Conservative Party would face electoral oblivion with Liz Truss?
Because if we get rid of her, then we are basically, I think we're faced with having a general election. There's another 18 months, 2 years before a general election is due, and our ship of state has been blown off course. There's no doubt about that, and it's been a very troublesome couple of weeks. But I think that if we stick with the team at the helm at the moment, that's the way forward. And we've just got to build confidence.
What gives you that confidence?
Well, experience, I think, that if you really ditch your leaders, it normally makes things worse rather than better. I myself, I said at the time when Boris was ousted, I said we rue the day that we did this, and unfortunately I seem to be proved right rather sooner than I expected. But I think we rue the day even more if we got rid of Liz Truss. Apart from anything else, there's no way in which you could get rid of her without triggering an election, a leadership election, changing the rules, and creating a whole lot more chaos in the country at a time when we should be concentrating on sorting out our economic and political problems and the war in Ukraine.
So stick with nurse for fear of worse. Is that sort of, does that?
Well, I wouldn't put it quite like that, but I mean, I go halfway towards that. Yes.
John Trickett, I mean, looking from the opposition benches, I mean, you're looking very cheerful tonight with a 36-point opinion poll lead. I guess you would be.
Yeah.
But let's go back to the question. Do you think changing leaders for the Tories and putting Rishi Sunak in would save them from electoral oblivion?
Well, look, I was first elected in 96, so before the big victory which Tony Blair achieved. I worked under Tony Blair. I've worked under every leader except Keir. I worked in Downing Street for Gordon. Here's what I think. In 96, and throughout those New Labour years, it was clear something had happened in the country. The country had changed, it had fallen out of love with the Conservative Party, and it was clear we were heading to a Labour victory, and we got a big one, and we built on that, as we know, through quite a few elections. Now, I think something like that's happened now. The country's fallen out of love with the Conservative Party. I don't believe they're going to pull it back, whoever their leader is. Sunak himself is very vulnerable to the argument that the crisis which has happened now occurred after the Sunak years. And therefore the economy, we don't know quite how bad it is, but it's clearly quite bad. And obviously it's partly his creation. So I think he's very vulnerable. But that is, the Tories have all got their fingerprints all over what you might call the scene of the crime. The country's fallen out with them. They're not going to get back into power at the next election.
I mean, this might sound a stupid question, given there's a 36-point opinion poll lead, but has the country fallen in love with Labour under Keir Starmer in the same way that I think the country did with Tony Blair?
Well, look, I think there's always more to do for any opposition leader. And, you know, we had a very, very difficult election in 2019. Keir's obviously felt he needed to reconstruct how the party operates and how it's seen. I don't agree with everything he's done, but he is the leader of the party. And it's arguable, actually, that the country's looking for somebody who's steady, who's calm, and who roughly is in the kind of mood where the country is. Now, we've got possibly 2 more years to the election. I'm hoping that Keir's going to become increasingly bold, more radical, more transformative in the kind of proposals he's making. But he's making steady progress. I think we need to move faster. We need more clarity about where it is we're going. And yeah, there's always more to do. I remember Tony Blair very, very clearly. I knew him quite well in those early years before the 97 election. I mean, what he always said was, there's more to do, John. We need more time. Don't get complacent. OK, we've got opinion poll leads. We could drop it. We could lose the whole thing. And I think that's probably where Keir is. So I want to be fair to the party leader. I want to see a Labour victory. He's our leader. Therefore, we want him in number 10.
Camilla Turner, I imagine you've been talking to a fair few Conservative MPs today. I mean, going back to Anthony's question, could a Sunak premiership save the Tories from electoral oblivion? Chris Chope basically said, well, the parliamentary party wouldn't accept him. What's your view?
Well, from the Tory MPs I've been speaking to today, I'd say the majority opinion seems to be, particularly among the kind of elder statesmen who have been around a while and have seen these kind of things come around a few times now, is that the party is pretty much in a situation of damned if you do, damned if you don't. Even if Liz Truss is ousted and that causes further instability and a new leader, possibly Rishi Sunak or possibly someone else, is installed, fundamentally that won't be enough to save the Conservative Party from the mess that it's now in. And some MPs are now saying the fact that we'll lose the next general election is certain. It's just a case of by how much. So that is the level of doom among some MPs about the current state of things.
So bring back Boris, Chris Chope.
Well, I don't think we can bring back Boris. I think we need to stick with Liz. And we've been in situations before where there's been massive opinion poll deficits. And how do you recover from that? You stick to your guns. And I think
it didn't work for John Major,
reset.
did it? Didn't work for John Major.
It did work for John Major in a sense because after he's helped oust Margaret Thatcher, he ensured that we won the 92 general election.
But then he put himself up for re-election in 1995. I don't know whether you supported him or I think you were a minister then, weren't you?
No, I wasn't. That was my period out.
Oh, was it?
Out of Parliament. I've got no regrets about that.
Sorry to remind you of that. I do apologise. But I mean, it didn't work for him in the sense that he then went down to a defeat. Whereas if they got Michael Portillo in or somebody else, it might have been a lesser defeat. I've no idea. None of us will ever know.
I think what had happened then was that the Conservatives had been in office for such a long time that they'd run out of steam.
You mean a bit like now?
Well, not quite like this, because obviously Liz was going to inject a fresh lot of steam into it, and that's why I supported her, because I was very much in favour of changing the economic situation so that we went for growth and low taxes and re-galvanised our economy.
Well, you must feel completely betrayed then by all these U-turns that have been announced.
Well, I feel very let down, obviously, and I'm very extremely disappointed. But I see this
quite cheerful.
Well, I've got to be cheerful because I see it as a tactical retreat rather than a strategic withdrawal, if I can put it like that. So that's why I think we you
lose the battle, but you're still going to win the war.
We work together, withdraw a bit, but then we can come forward again with our pro-growth, low-tax policies.
Ben Nunn, what do you make of all of this?
In answer to the question, I mean, it slightly depends on how you define oblivion, but I don't think Rishi can salvage this now, because I think what that mini budget the other week did was, for the first time in 20, 30 years, blew the Conservatives' credibility on the economy. I think that has done deep structural damage to their reputation on the economy. And I think it's very hard to see how that can be restored. And I think the public see through kind of different leaders and, moving of the deck chairs. I don't think they particularly like it, but it has a sense of a party that has slightly given up on government and is struggling with the fundamentals of government. I actually thought this before, I even thought this a couple of years ago. If there is an election in 2 years' time, the Conservatives would have been in power for 14 years by that point. And in that time, they would have been presided over an economic decline, and one that's been accelerated the last couple of weeks. They would have been exposed as quite divided. And thirdly, they would have shown signs of a tired government. And I think tired parties that have overseen economic decline and are divided don't tend to win elections. So I think whoever inherited it from Johnson was going to struggle, but I cannot see how a new leader can salvage this, because I think it's very damaging.
There is a historical example which Chris and John, you'll both remember. Back in 1986, when Thatcher, after the Westland crisis, everyone thought she was sort of dead in the water, and I think she did too at one point. And then they reinvigorated themselves at the conference in 1986. Do you remember that slogan, "The next moves forward"? And I remember every day there were sort of leaflets with different new, quite exciting policies, actually. And the whole atmosphere of the party changed. And then she went on to win a 100-seat majority in 1987. So it's not impossible, but do you not think, Chris, that when you've lost your reputation for economic competence, and I mean, I don't think you can't argue that hasn't happened, it's really difficult to get it back very quickly? It took 18 years after 1992.
But there's more to this than economics, because there is, for example, a lot of my constituents are incensed that we have still got no control over immigration coming across the Channel. And we've got now a new Home Secretary. And if, for example, the new Home Secretary was to be effective in reversing that policy and getting control over our borders again, and was to take tougher action against these ridiculous protesters who are blocking the Dartford crossing and so on. Those are other ways in which the Conservatives could regain support. So it's not just about the economy. Obviously, the economy is important, but there are other aspects of this, and that's why I think that getting rid of the Prime Minister, and which would involve getting rid of her new team as well, is the wrong solution.
I just remember James Carville, Bill Clinton's advisor, saying it's the economy, stupid.
Well, of course, I don't dispute that. But
if you are faced with extra mortgage payments of an extra £500 a month, do you really care how many if a few thousand people are coming across the Channel and not being stopped? I'm not sure you do.
I'm not sure also on the mortgage rates, interest rates, they haven't hit yet for many people.
No.
It's going to be the middle of next year when interest rates are looking at 5, 6, 7, 8% for a mortgage. That is when people are going to really, really feel it. So, we keep talking about the polls and saying, can they get any worse? I genuinely don't think people can actually say no, because I think it is the economy that has shaped public opinion in the last couple of days, and a sense that the government's lost a grip of the economy. But I don't think all of the public are yet feeling it. And when they do start feeling it, I think it's going to get far, far worse.
Right. Thank you very much for your question, Anthony. We'll come to more questions in a moment. 0345 6060 973. It's 8:15.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
It's 19 minutes past 8. With us in the studio, John Trickett, Labour MP, Sir Christopher Chope, Conservative MP, Ben Nunn, former Executive Director of Communications for the Labour Party under Keir Starmer, and Camilla Turner, Chief Political Correspondent for the Daily Telegraph. Right, our next question is from Jake in Orpington on the text. Very simple question in 6 words. Who is in charge of the country? Ben?
Jeremy Hunt. I think in terms of the government, I think Jeremy Hunt is, and I think we've seen that today and the decisions he's taken. There is a more interesting question about how the markets have influenced and shaped government policy in such a dramatic way. I think that's more of a theological and existential question. But in terms of who's dictating government policy today, it's been Jeremy Hunt.
So when he announced this afternoon the creation of this new Economic Advisory Council and announced 4 people on it so far, but there would be others, and they were all sort of bankers, JP Morgan, BlackRock and whatever. You think, well, given what's happened in the market since the budget, you could argue that it's actually the financial markets that are in charge of the country, couldn't you?
I think there is a really it's for cleverer people than me, but there is a really interesting question about that. I mean, the extent to which the markets have dictated media narrative, political decision-making and then policy-making is quite extraordinary. And I don't think we've ever seen that before in this country. I think it's been quite extraordinary. Now, Jeremy Hunt has a legitimate argument to say, look, the decisions I've taken today about economic security and protecting people's pensions and etc. But it is, the extent to which they have influence has been quite extraordinary. And as I said, quite unprecedented.
John Trickett.
Well, it's extraordinary that you've got a faction of the Tory party who believe in free markets. And
I thought the entire Tory party believes in free markets.
Well, maybe.
I think most of the Labour Party
and also shrinking the state down so that the market is given complete, almost control. Have hit against the market within a few days. It's quite an extraordinary thing. When people talk about mini budget, by the way, it wasn't a mini budget. It was actually a bomb right under the economy. What they've done is they've impacted on Middle England, middle class, middle income earners, and they were never, I don't think, going to persuade the poor that they were on their side. But when you think about, tuition fees for kids, the mortgage, the people often have maybe decent large houses, the heating costs. It's middle income. It's middle income earners who have now been impacted in a way which no Tory government that I can ever remember has experienced before.
But back to the question, who's in charge of the country?
Well, I think, the markets are clearly in charge of the economy. And it's up to government to try to control the markets if they can live with that ideologically. Now, I just want to come to Hunt a minute, because he's the man who was there at the beginning when austerity started. And austerity, and people have had enough of austerity. Wages, salaries going down, or static services which you depend on completely cut to the bone. Now what's Hunt providing? What's he suggesting? More austerity. Well, let me just say this. That is why they're not going to win another election for a generation, simply because people have had a bellyful of Tory austerity. And I think that the Labour has to be clear. These are Tory cuts imposed by mismanagement of the economy. And
but what you're implying there is that there needs to be extra spending, which is what traditionally the electorate have always worried about Labour.
Yeah.
And if there is going to be all this extra spending on, all the things that you say, totally agree that there's an argument for that. But if the financial markets get spooked by that, we're back to square one, aren't we?
The mistake they made was they thought they could spend all this money. Let's be honest, this was a massive spending splurge by the Tories. That's what this was, and unfunded, and without any evidence whatsoever to say that they could pay the money back. That's why we're in the state that we're in now and why the markets have reacted. Look, and I didn't agree with everything which Jeremy and John McDonnell did, but what we did provide was a detailed the so-called Grey Book analysis of where every penny was coming from, and this is a wealthy
you
country.
might have done in 2017. You didn't in 2019 because
in 2019,
every day John McDonnell was coming out with another spending.
The 2019, which I've got in my the Grey Book, is I have it with me tonight, and let me tell you,
please don't get it out.
But let me just make one point.
Life is too.
Keir and Rachel Reeves have come up with a proposal, which maybe people are not aware of. You can live in this country, you can work in this country, you can earn money in this country, but you can register yourself for tax purposes abroad. These are the people called non-doms. They're not domiciled in the UK to pay tax. If you were to end it, and it's Labour saying we would end it, it's £3 billion a year just from that one measure alone. But the trouble is that the Tories, and it may be there's some people in my party too, don't want to take on wealth, but we should. Because we tax income, but we don't tax wealth.
Just before I come to the other two panellists, a quick word about Rachel Reeves today. I thought that was her best performance ever. I thought she was on fire, she was eloquent, she was passionate, something that I'm not sure... I don't think she's a natural speech maker, a natural performer, but I thought today you saw a very different side to her.
It's not easy, and she made a couple of quite good jokes, it seemed to me. I thought she was on form. I think the wind's in our sails. The country's decided it doesn't want the Tories anymore. We've got to seal the deal, though.
There's a bit of... there's a bit of... Rachel's quite not dissimilar with Keir. They are lockstep. I know we've heard that a lot of times. They genuinely are. They are genuinely lockstep. But Keir always used to get less so now. Used to get underestimated on those big parliamentary moments. People never thought he could do it, but he always used to rise to it. Rachel's quite like that as well. People aren't quite sure, but she does really rise to it, and she was brilliant today.
Camilla Turner, back to Jake's question. Who's in charge of the country, apart from the Daily Telegraph?
What if it was?
I lost faith in trust too.
I think I agree with what you were saying just now about Jeremy Hunt. Certainly from all the Conservative MPs I was speaking to today, who heard Jeremy Hunt address them in a private meeting, the sense they got from that was that he was absolutely holding the reins, and even speaking to sort of cabinet sources, also saying from the cabinet meeting that was held this morning, it's very clear that Jeremy Hunt is in charge. And I think we can see, even by the timeline of what's happened recently, Jeremy Hunt installed as Chancellor over the weekend, hinting very strongly that he's going to be ripping up parts of the mini budget, and then first thing this morning bringing forward that statement, and then essentially reversing some of the really major policies, even more so than we have already, in that mini budget. So clearly he's come in and already completely been given a carte blanche to just do exactly what he wants, and then also be the main communicator of it all to the party and to the rest of the country.
Which he's at, given that I gather he was on a family holiday in Belgium on Friday morning when he got the call. I mean, given that he then had to rush back on Friday and has done all of this over the weekend, and actually, I don't know whether you'd agree with this, Chris Chope, been quite a reassuring voice in all of this. I mean, whether you agree with the U-turns or not, he's actually stepped up to the plate in a way that I'm not sure I can imagine many other politicians being able to do.
Yeah, in that respect, he was a good choice. Who appointed him? Who appointed him? Liz Truss appointed him. So she's in charge. And who worked with him closely at Chequers on Sunday on his package? Liz Truss did. So Liz Truss is very much in charge. But the other people who I think are still trying to be in charge are the anti-growth coalition. And they have fought back very strongly over the last week or so. And I think it's important that Liz and her team now see them off.
Who is this anti-growth coalition? Because who, apart from mad environmentalists, and I'm talking about the extreme environmentalists, who is anti-growth? We're all in favour of growth, aren't we?
Well, I mean, John just identified he wanted to penalise non-DOMs and penalise them to the extent of £3 billion, recognising that the yield of tax already is about 900 billion. So it's a trivia, but it just shows a prejudice against people who are foreign nationals who want to help our country.
The one thing I would say that Truss has said, which is correct, is this country needs to grow the economy. I mean, I represent some of the poorest people in the whole country, and when you ask the question, how much wealth are they producing per hour, it's measured by something called GVA, which we don't need to go into. GVA per hour, it's very, very low because of lack of investment, and therefore the wages and salaries are low as well. So we have to drive up productivity in order to be able to pay people a proper income and drive growth. But you don't do it by abandoning all of government and handing everything over to the market.
Let's introduce a sort of allied question here, because I think the consensus is sort of Jeremy Hunt is, even if he's not the most powerful, he's one of the most powerful. Gareth in Matlock has a question. Hello, Gareth.
Good evening, Ian. Nice to speak to you.
Hi.
Yeah, so my question, very simply, and I think it's in tune with your programme, has Jeremy Hunt today instigated a policy of austerity Mark II?
Yep.
It's on behalf of the Conservative Party.
Yep.
Well, John, you kind of already addressed this, but you clearly think he has.
I did, and I think the reason why I believe that the Tories are out whenever the election is taking place is precisely because we've seen it all before. Let me just, if you don't mind, let me just quickly, in our area, the school holiday is finished. People can't buy the clothes that the children need, the school uniforms. And so there's a school uniform bank in Featherstone, in my constituency. 34 families turned up the other night. One woman with 5 children, she couldn't put shoes on the children's feet to go to school or to go anywhere. The children's feet were all covered in blisters and crooked as a result of it. And now, don't tell them that they've got to put with more austerity. And I could fill this whole hour with stories, I won't do, but that just, it's heartbreaking.
But, I mean, playing devil's advocate for a second, I mean, at any time over the last 2 centuries, somebody could have come on this programme and said, well, poverty is terrible, and here's an example of something that's happening in my area. Well, even the richest countries in the world, of which we're one, Switzerland, Germany, they will all have pockets of poverty.
Of course.
But, I mean, what you're saying is it's more than
structural.
Pockets.
It's structural. And I was first elected in 1984 as a councillor. I became the leader of Leeds, and then I went on to work in Downing Street and various other places in Parliament.
You've done terribly well for yourself.
Thank you very much. I think I'm doing best now. I'm doing best now as a backbencher. But here's the point I was going to make. And so I've been around, and I've represented working class communities in the north of England. Let me tell you something. This is the worst I've ever seen it in my public life.
And you're saying that not as a Labour politician, but somebody who's experienced...
Just as a human being dealing with, £25 for a shirt if you've got 3 kids going to school. It's £250 to clothe a child to go to school in a school uniform. And now the schools are actually saying you've got to buy a shirt with the school logo on it. It costs more money. And if you don't wear the logo, you can't go into school. I mean, it's very cruel. But the poverty
totally
in my patch is...
that school uniforms should be abolished.
No, I'm not against school uniforms, but I am just pointing out the problems which people are facing in our country, and that is why the Tory idea that more austerity, it ain't going to work.
Right, I'm going to come to the other 3 panellists in a second because we have to go to news headlines with Daryl Jackson at 8:31.
The new Chancellor insists Liz Truss will still be Prime Minister by Christmas and is urging everyone to give her a chance. Jeremy Hunt's reversal almost all major tax cuts, which she'd promised in the last month's mini-budget. Meanwhile, the Chancellor's also announced targeted support for household energy bills from April, but the head of the National Grid has also told the Financial Times Energy Transition Summit we face blackouts between 4pm and 7pm on really, really cold nights in January and February in a worst-case scenario. And Scotland's First Minister says it's utterly nonsense to suggest people would need passports to get into England if it broke away from the UK. Nicola Sturgeon hopes to achieve Scottish independence for the country. A second referendum's not been granted, though. LBC weather tonight will be dry and clear for most. A few showers will linger in northern Scotland, and the far south will see patchy cloud edge in towards dawn. A low of 7 degrees.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
8:35, Chris Chope, Camilla Turner, Ben Nunn and John Trickett with us answering your calls. Now, we were just answering a question from Gareth in Matlock, or at least John was. Has Jeremy Hunt introduced austerity Mark II today? Chris Chope.
No, he hasn't. And he was at pains to point out that this is not an austerity budget, although we'll find out the details of the budget on the 31st of October. But I think it's a bit of wishful thinking on John Trickett's part to think that this is going to be able to be regarded as just austerity. What is important is that we get better value for money in our public services. We increase productivity. And I heard from Jeremy Hunt a determination to get to grips with a lot of the waste which there is in the public sector.
Well, why is there still waste after 12 years of a Tory government?
Because we let it drift, because we became complacent. It's all part of the debt-fueled economy which we were given, I think, by the Bank of England. We became relaxed about it, took our eye off the ball, and I hold Boris responsible for quite a lot of that, because getting down to getting value for money and squeezing the extra out of our services, he never really got down to that. And productivity in the NHS has been falling. It's extraordinary. We keep throwing this money at the NHS. We get promises that this is going to be in return for increased productivity. But if you look at all the figures, the NHS productivity continues to decline, and that's a disaster.
How do you measure productivity in the NHS?
Well, there's a way of doing it, and that basically means how much bang do you get for your buck? And the short answer is we get more bucks and fewer bangs.
There's a joke there somewhere if you look hard enough. Camilla.
Tell the joke.
No, I was waiting for you to do that. Camilla.
Well, I think, this is just another one of the many U-turns we've had in recent days. It wasn't so long ago that we had Liz Truss standing in the Commons promising that there'll be absolutely no public spending cuts, only for Jeremy Hunt to come in and to completely obliterate
Week
that.
is a long time in politics.
Talking about all the efficiencies that will need to be made, and of course one man's efficiencies is another man's cuts. So we haven't had a huge amount of detail on these yet, but we have had a clear signal and a warning that these kind of cuts will be coming, and probably coming on quite a large scale. Whether that is as big a scale as George Osborne's austerity.
Is cuts a different word for austerity?
I suppose austerity, if you're thinking about it in the George Osborne terms, it's a whole kind of attitude to public finances, where it's a whole kind of ethos where you're overhauling your entire finances to try and find really quite sweeping cuts. We have had this strong indication that there will be cuts, but whether it will be quite as fundamental and quite as much of an overhaul as it was under George Osborne, Jeremy Hunt is denying, but he has hinted that there will be cuts nonetheless.
But the Prime Minister didn't actually say cuts. She used the expression reductions in public expenditure. And reduction,
Come on, what's the difference?
But reductions in public expenditure would be possible without actually reducing public expenditure completely, because we've got high inflation, and so in the same way as people's wages are declining in real terms, it's possible that if the public sector doesn't get as much as the full inflation increases, then we will actually get better value for money forced out of the public sector. I mean, years ago when I was leader of Wandsworth Council and we had the crisis around 1981, we took 20% out of Wandsworth Council's budget, reduced the local tax to the lowest in the country, and that delivered 40 years of Conservative control in Wandsworth. That can be done, and all it needs is the will on the part of the government to do it.
I suppose, Ben Nunn, we should remember that austerity policies were created by Chancellor Philip Snowden and Stafford Cripps back in the 30s and 40s.
Possibly, yeah. I mean, you may well remember that. I mean,
even I'm not that
old. I think I kind of agree with Camilla. I don't think we don't know the details of what's coming. There's something, there's obviously details to come, but I think it will. Whether you call it austerity, I think it will feel bad, and I think people will feel. Will have a very difficult couple of years coming, because there's a combination of, you have got public services that are under an extraordinary amount of strain, whether it's huge waiting lists, pressures on schools, some of the things John has talked about. But unlike what we had under austerity under David Cameron and George Osborne, we've got very high inflation and we've got rising interest rates, and that's going to put a real squeeze on people's pockets. And the other thing I think I'd say is, for whether right or wrong, and the debate was 12 years ago now, so it's over. In 2010, I think the public were ready for austerity in some ways, in as much as they'd had 2 or 3 years.
I think they understood it.
That's a better way of saying it. Yeah, they understood austerity, and they understood it was coming. They could see it coming because they'd had 2 years of a political debate about cuts and the need to trim back budgets. The public aren't ready for it this time, not least because over the summer and in 2019, they were promised boom, best years ahead, levelling up, everything's getting better, sunshine, champagne at the end of a rainbow, all the good stuff. And it's now they're going to be hit with a hard, cold reality. And Jeremy Hunt, to his credit, was facing up to it today, but he's probably the first politician in the government that started talking about it.
Gareth, thank you very much for that. Rupert in Lancaster has a question. Hi, Rupert.
Hello, Ian. Yeah, my question is, does it suit the Labour Party to keep Liz Truss in office?
John Trickett.
Well, I don't think like that. I mean, look, I represent, as I've said already, quite some very poor people in Yorkshire, in the north of England, and I have to face up to them, and it's very difficult. And so I want to see the back of her because she took a bomb to the economy, and it was a disgrace what they did. Whether or not those people are going to suffer for the next 2 years under a Tory government, if that's when the election is, means I think that whoever takes over from her is actually going to be attacking the communities that I represent. So, look, in the end of the day, they can shuffle the deck chairs as much as they like, but it is a Titanic. It's going down. Well, what worries me is the damage it's doing to the people that I live amongst and represent. And it's very touching to see people. So
you don't think it would make any difference whether Rishi Sunak, Penny Mordaunt, Boris Johnson, Uncle Tom Cobley was leader of the Conservative Party on Labour's election chances? Because I would have thought there has to be some sort of difference there.
I'm not convinced. I think the country have had enough, and as I've said several times, I don't want to repeat myself too much, but they've had enough, and they want to see a change, a new direction, a hope. It maybe there'll be some difficult times if there's a change in government, but people will feel that we're in a different trajectory, and that's what I think. People are suffering out in the country. They are in London as well. I don't make it a north versus south or a north versus London thing, but I represent a place in the north which is really, really left behind. We have to get rid of these people, and so for me, I'm afraid it doesn't make the slightest bit of difference.
Ben?
Politically, yes, I think it does, because I think she has... I mean, firstly, it is extraordinary. She's, 40-odd days into her premiership? 42. It is worth keeping count. 42 days into her premiership, and we're already talking about her going. I realised the other day, my son turned 6 months old last week, and he has seen 2 prime ministers and 4 chancellors in that time.
What did he make of that?
Well, my wife is currently looking after him, so you can get her to phone in. But I was 6 years old before I saw that kind of record. So it is extraordinary we're talking about this. But politically, yes, I think it does help Labour, to be frank. But I really, really do agree with John. No one wants this. This is, take the politics out of this. This is really grim for the country, because it makes governing so much harder, because we're just not governing properly. There's huge concern about the stability of our economy, which means we're not going to see the growth everybody wants to see. And thirdly, I think it just fuels this real dissatisfaction amongst people with our politics, and a sense that our politics is just simply not functioning. So yes, politically it is advantageous for Labour, there's no getting away from that, but is this good for the country? No.
Unless you have anything particularly burning to say on this question, it was kind of aimed at. But Chris, you do want to comment.
No, not Ben. Just to say that the way to solve the problems that John's been describing is to grow the economy. And what disappoints me so much about what has happened in the last week is that the policies for growing the economy have had to be put into temporary reverse.
Liz Truss has been speaking to the One Nation group of Conservative MPs. They're traditionally on the more left of the party. And Ian Watson, the BBC reporter, says one of them told him, "It's the first time I've heard a corpse deliver its own eulogy."
Dear me.
8:45.
LBC. Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player.
Hundreds of criminals in uniform are getting away with sexual misconduct, racism and misogyny in Britain's biggest police force. Louise, now Baroness Casey, is in the studio with me.
One of the things that is wrong in the Metropolitan Police is how they deal with their misconduct.
Commissioner of the Met, Sir Mark Rowley, did you shed a tear when you saw the breadth of this report?
The combination over the last few weeks of seeing advanced drafts of the report, and I have shed a tear.
It's not that long ago that you had a senior post at the Met. You never saw any of this sort of material.
I sat on some misconduct panels. I was pretty ruthless. There was almost nobody I ever kept in the organisation. Louise Casey has got under our skin like nobody else before. It's very powerful. It's very humbling.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
With Motorway, where dealers compete to give you their best price for your car.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
Bruce Springsteen.
8:49 is the time. John Trickett, Sir Christopher Chope, Ben Nunn and Camilla Turner with us answering your questions. Here's a text question from Jason in Lancaster. Is Suella Braverman right to want stronger sentences for these environmentalist protesters after these Just Oil people have been blocking the QE2 bridge all day? I think they climbed 80 metres up, which, I mean, I went over that bridge last night, and I mean, anybody that does that is incredibly brave or an absolute fool or both. But it's effectively shut the bridge for the whole day. So bigger fines, bigger sentences. I mean, the police have had a lot of criticism over the past couple of years for not taking strong action against people who block roads. Camilla?
Well, I think this is something that really exercises a lot of voters. It's causes inconvenience to their commuting, to just getting around and living their daily lives. And of course, those aren't the people who are making decisions about oil or about these environmental protections that the protesters are worried about. So you're just inconveniencing people who won't really help you solve the problems you're setting out to address. So I think whilst we shouldn't be overly heavy-handed for what is essentially a peaceful protest, there does need to be some kind of deterrent for people that sort of puts them off causing this amount of disruption.
But a protest, particularly this one, which will have, it'll lead to them being accused of being in the anti-growth coalition, because it will have reduced economic activity. It will have prevented people from getting to their meetings, preventing deliveries getting to where they've got to go to. But in terms of stronger sentences, what would you suggest?
I mean, I wouldn't like to pluck a figure out of the sky.
I was thinking more hanging, flogging, quartering, that sort of thing. Okay. Well, that's what Suella Braverman would want to do, isn't it?
Well, I don't know about that, but I do think a lot of voters are on the side of taking a bit of a stronger stance against these protests. We've seen a lot in recent years causing pretty widespread disruptions on the roads, on transport, in all sorts of places. So I think we don't need to be too heavy-handed, but there does need to be enough of a deterrent that actually stops this happening, because at the moment we've just had a huge proliferation of these kind of disruptive protests.
Ben Nunn.
I don't think it'll work. I totally agree with Camilla. It's definitely get exercises people because they see it in their day-to-day lives and it's incredibly frustrating. I don't think tougher sentences will be a sufficient deterrent, and we've heard this kind of, policy by press release a few times. I think Priti Patel announced a few similar initiatives when she was Home Secretary.
Don't you just hanker for Priti Patel?
No. No, I don't. So I don't think this approach to trying to deter, I don't think it will work.
David in Twickenham has a comment, going back to a comment about your 6-month-old. Says, never mind a 6-month-old seeing 2 prime ministers and 4 chancellors. It's the first time Chelsea have remained unbeaten during the reign of a chancellor. Well, there you go. That's good. John Trickett.
On the question of protest, I think, we don't live in a society that's purely based on social justice and economic justice, and clearly now people are very motivated by protecting the planet. And I can understand why people do protest. You do pay a price if you protest. If you go on strike, you lose income. If you make protests and you break the law, you will probably be arrested. You may be charged. And the judiciary, the magistrates, however, will make a decision about the severity of the sentence. I don't fall out with that people may have to pay a price for protesting. But what I do say is, in a grossly, obscenely unequal society, there will be increasing amounts of protest. And we can do one of two things. We can either try to crack down, move towards a less libertarian, more authoritarian society, or we can try to address the underlying issues. And so, I think that, I don't know what these people are going to be charged with, if they have been charged. I don't know what the maximum sentence is. It seems to me the Home Secretary is playing to the lowest common denominator in British politics.
Chris Chope.
Well, I think deterrent sentences are absolutely essential. For years, the courts have, when there's an issue, whether it be racial violence or something, an issue which is causing essentially people to get really angry, and it's a breach of the peace. This is what this is, really. Motorists getting so angry. We must have deterrent sentences. But I also think that the police are supine in closing these roads. Just because you climb up on the QE2 bridge, why should the public have to stop driving across that bridge? And it seems sometimes that we are too indulgent of these protesters and thereby enable them to achieve their objective of causing lots of problems. So I think a mixture of the two, and you could also actually start suing some of them for the financial consequences of their actions.
Good luck with that. Martin sent a tweet in, going back to your comments, John, about school uniforms. He says, "Evening, Ian. Have you seen how much kit is required at your old school, Saffron Walden County High School, by the way, in Essex? Apparently, Gray Palmer, gentlemen's outfitters in Saffron Walden, apparently Gray Palmer offers a pay-what-you-can-afford discount to those who can swallow the embarrassment. But crikey, glad my kids went to the Friends School on a bursary." Well, there you are. I mean, I think it's a really difficult thing. It
is a difficult thing, and you know, who would want to be a parent who can't clothe their own child?
Yeah.
And yet there are people in that situation in our country today, in one of the richest countries of the world. And that's my point about all this. And I was never convinced at the beginning about everybody going on to school uniforms, but clearly it works. But the cost of...
Funny how it works in Germany without school uniforms as well.
Well, that is true. That is true. But look, there seems to be a consensus that schools should have uniforms.
Now, we're going to have rather quick answers from you for this next question. It's from Jackson in Dagenham. Jackson, hi, go ahead.
Hello, Ian and Palanis. I'm a Labour voter. I'm a Jeremy Corbyn voter, actually, and I don't hold any truck with these policies of Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng. But listening to LBC, the quality of discussion is almost varying on the personal attacks. How can we, as commentators and experts, tone down our discussions and keep it only to policy and not to individual personal attacks? How can we do this?
Do you not think that personality is important in politics, though, and that if you haven't got the kind of personality that can cope with media interrogation or even parliamentary interrogation, that says something about your leadership skills?
I think it's personable to see someone struggling in those particular areas of communication, but that's human. But what I want to stick to as a listener, what I want to stick to are the policies. You agree with it or disagree with it. But when it comes to, I've been listening all day, and when it comes to commentators, whether it's gobs on a stick or experts, seeming to attack individuals. These people have families. These people have feelings. Now, I do not agree with their policies.
All right. No, Jackson, I've just looked at the time, and my panel is only going to have 30 seconds each to answer this. But it's a really good point. Camilla, let's start with you.
I think it's pretty inescapable to talk about personality when at the moment there are huge question marks over the capability of our Prime Minister to lead the country. I think that is all about personality because she's the person at the top of the Conservative Party and they are in power. So if not personality, I don't know what that's about. That, of course, policy comes into it as well with all the U-turns, but ultimately it also comes up to her own ability to carry the party with her and to persuade people that she's on the right track.
I mean, let's not make this all about Liz Truss because we could talk about lots of politicians in this regard, but I mean, Jeremy Corbyn had a lot of this, didn't he, John?
Well, he did, and some of it was a lot of it was very, very unfair. But look, I think avoid personal abuse, but maybe discuss the personal qualities of an individual. Whether, for example, Liz Truss is a very good communicator is a decent question to ask, but avoid the personal abuse. People don't like it, and it's not necessary.
Ben?
I agree with John and Camilla. I think ultimately a politician's character does determine how fit they are for government, and I appreciate that some of the criticisms are hard, and I do have sympathy for kind of the Prime Minister and her family, but ultimately when you've got a Prime Minister who's a poor communicator, that is a problem, and that and we've seen the impact of that.
Chris?
Well, I think we should respect the office of Prime Minister. and we attack the government or any individual for their policies, but don't actually attack the position in which they are held. And I think it's rather like in soccer or in games, you play the ball and not the person. And that's what I think we should be doing.
Okay. Right, final text question from Lauren in Whitby. The price of a weekend ticket to Glastonbury, Chris goes every year, has gone up to 340 quid. Ridiculous. Which band or artist would your panel spend that much money to go and see? John Trickett.
I wouldn't spend that money on going to see an artist, but I would spend a considerable amount of money, not that much, to go see Bruce Springsteen at Hyde Park, but the prices are even higher than...
Several people heard you mention his name just as we came back.
Yeah, so they probably did, yeah.
I should admit here, on the final text question, I sometimes give them notice of that so they can think of a reasonable answer. Ben?
David Bowie.
Oh,
but,
really?
Well, but it's going to cost a bit more than that to bring him back to life. So.
Yeah, I saw him in Detroit in 1987, the last Spider tour. Didn't play any of his greatest hits. And that's what most people go to a concert for, isn't it? Chris?
Well, I'd go for Bryn Terfel at the Grange Opera.
Who?
Bryn Terfel.
Okay.
But maybe I'd spend money on going to the opera and taking my wife to the opera. And if people want to go to Glastonbury, good luck to them.
Does she enjoy the opera?
My wife enjoys
inflict it on her?
I don't inflict it on her. No, it's almost a demand by her on me that I should send us to the opera.
Fair enough. I tried to get into opera once, but I couldn't. Lovely music interrupted by screeching. Camilla?
Well, this will probably give away my age, but I think I'd say Oasis, because they were my childhood favourite band, and I would be able to sing along and know all the words to every song.
Okay. Great stuff. Thank you very much indeed. John Trickett, Sir Christopher Chope, Ben Nunn and Camilla Turner. We have another edition of Cross Question tomorrow at 8 o'clock as usual. And we have Rebecca Long-Bailey on, former senior Metropolitan Police Officer and now Lib Dem peer Brian Paddock, and Samuel Kasumu, who's running to be Conservative candidate for the next Mayor of London, and SNP MP David Linden. Coming up in a moment, we're going to continue our discussion on the trials of one Elizabeth Truss. 0345 6060 973. Where do you see all this going? Do you think that calls for a general election are getting so loud that they will be impossible to ignore? It's 9:02.